Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
Mom said, "We love you equally, Hannah. We just show it differently." Then she handed Emma a spa weekend in a glossy envelope with her name written in swirling gold ink, while I got a chipped mug with "Stay Positive" printed in Comic Sans and a cold cup of tea, steeped too long and bitter, like an afterthought, or worse, like a message. The cup was already on the table when I walked in, no ceremony, no eye contact, just Mom's hand motioning toward it as she smiled with her jaw too tight, the kind of smile that says, "Let's not do this today." Emma giggled while reading the spa brochure, flipping it open and holding it against her chest like it was a love letter. "Oh my God, Mom, you didn't have to," she said, although we all knew she did and always would. Her nails, painted soft pink with little diamonds on the ring fingers, sparkled in the overhead light as she reached out and touched Mom's arm with a soft familiarity that had always made me feel like a guest in my own family. I sipped the tea. It was cold. No sugar. No lemon. No honey. Just bitterness. And it hit me then, not as a revelation but as confirmation, like something I had always suspected but never allowed myself to fully admit. Mom didn't love us equally. She just didn't. It had always been Emma. From the moment she was born, blonde and blue-eyed and easy to adore, she became the sun we all had to orbit. I was older, 2 years her senior, darker-haired, quieter, and prone to questions that made adults uncomfortable. I wasn't difficult, I was just inconvenient. I didn't break the rules, but I noticed when others did. And I remembered. That was my crime. I remembered everything. Emma got the ballet classes and the glittery leotards. I got secondhand shoes and hand-me-downs that smelled faintly of dust and someone else's sweat. Emma got a Sweet 16 party with a DJ and a photo booth and floating candles. I got a "We're doing something small this year, sweetie, your sister's braces cost more than we thought." Even back then, the excuses were dressed up in concern and practicality, but they still felt like lies. And over the years, I learned not to ask questions because the answers were worse than the silence. When Dad was alive, things were a little more balanced. He had a way of making me feel seen. He'd bring me peanut M&Ms from the gas station, call me brains when I fixed the internet, laugh too loud at my sarcastic jokes. But he died 5 years ago in his sleep, heart attack in the middle of the night, and after that, the shift was undeniable. Mom, maybe out of grief or maybe just because she could now, turned all of her energy toward Emma like a laser beam. Emma, who lived only 20 minutes away and visited every Sunday. Emma, who gave her grandkids and baked pies and called 3 times a week. And me? I called when I had to. I showed up when invited. I tolerated it. Until that afternoon. Until the tea. I watched Emma sip her mug, the one I had swapped with mine just minutes earlier. The one I left with the lipstick stain and the faint sour smell. I didn't plan it. I swear I didn't. But when Mom set down both mugs, one meant for each of us, and then left the room to get the gift envelopes, I noticed the difference. One was clean. Warm. The other was mine. Already poured. Already cooling. She hadn't even waited for me to arrive. She poured mine like a waitress serving someone she didn't know, and it landed like a punch to the chest. So I switched them. I did it slowly. Deliberately. I even wiped the rim of the cleaner mug with my sleeve before placing it where mine had been. I didn't know why I did it, not really. It wasn't about the tea. It was about everything that came before it. About the birthdays, the missed recitals, the way Mom always forgot I hated mushrooms, but remembered Emma's Starbucks order down to the number of ice cubes. Emma lifted the mug, chatting absent-mindedly about how the spa included deep tissue massage and aromatherapy. "Can you believe this place even has eucalyptus saunas?" "I mean, who knew eucalyptus had saunas?" She laughed, sipping again. Her voice started to trail off, almost imperceptibly, like her throat was closing up. She cleared it. Once. Twice. She coughed. Mom turned sharply. "Em? You okay?" Emma coughed again, harder this time, and reached for a napkin. She pressed it to her lips and pulled it away slowly. Red. At first, I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, more forceful. A sputter. A spatter. the napkin soaked, her white blouse speckled with tiny dots of crimson. And Mom froze. Her face went pale, mouth open, eyes darting between Emma and the mug like it had just turned into a live grenade. And me? I didn't blink. I just stared. I watched the scene unfold like it was a movie I'd seen in a dream. Emma grabbing her throat, Mom scrambling, yelling for help, her voice shrill and distant, as if coming from underwater. The panic. The chaos. I sat completely still. The cold tea sat in my stomach like a stone. Later, someone would ask me if I was in shock. If that's why I was so quiet. I said yes, because that's easier than explaining the truth, that I had felt nothing but calm. That watching Emma panic and Mom unravel had brought me, if not joy, then something close to justice. Or maybe just balance. For once, the spotlight shifted. For once, I wasn't invisible. They say there's always a moment where you can turn back. Where you can stop and say, this isn't right, this isn't what I meant. But I didn't take it. I watched my sister cough blood and watched my mother's face drain of color, and I felt a sense of order returning to the world. And that's what scared me. Not what happened, but how natural it felt. There's a kind of ache that doesn't scream or stab. It hums, slow and steady, like a faint electric current running just beneath your skin, always present, never fatal, but impossible to ignore. That's what it felt like growing up next to Emma, a sister born not just with blonde curls and angelic dimples, but with a kind of gravitational pull that drew everyone around her in, especially Mom, who from the very beginning made it painfully clear. Even if she never said it out loud, that Emma was special and I was, well, reliable, quiet, maybe even necessary in some background kind of way, but never truly exceptional or particularly loved. I remember being 9 and coming home from school with a handmade card for Mother's Day, cut from thick pink paper with crooked hearts and the words, "I love you the mostest," written in glitter glue that smeared when it dried. I placed it on the kitchen table, proud and hopeful, waiting for the smile, the hug, the approval that I imagined other kids got in exchange for their efforts. But Mom barely looked up from the stove, muttering something like, "That's cute, honey," put it with the others, and gestured toward a pile of cards Emma had already brought home from kindergarten, each one adorned with crayon rainbows and neatly spelled letters that somehow seemed more worthy, more meaningful, even though mine was objectively better. That was the beginning of a long list of small moments, the kind that don't seem like much at the time, but years later pile up like sediment in your chest, weighing you down in places you didn't even know could carry grief. Emma got the softest blankets, the freshest strawberries, the better seat at the movies. She got the first slice of cake and the newest backpack. When we both got the flu one year, Mom stayed up all night with Emma, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth and whispering lullabies, while I was told to be strong and left with a lukewarm cup of Sprite and a box of tissues on the nightstand. Even sickness didn't earn me her full attention. It just gave her another reason to admire Emma's resilience, her sweet attitude, even while vomiting into a bowl I ended up cleaning. By the time we hit high school, I had stopped trying to compete. There was no point. Emma was homecoming queen, varsity cheerleader, the girl who managed to pull off straight A's without appearing to study, the one who dated boys with names like Chad and Connor and got invited to lake houses with boat rides and bonfires. I, on the other hand, wrote angry poetry in the margins of my biology notebook, got my driver's license 6 months late, and wore thrift store sweaters like armor, pretending not to care that I wasn't invited to the same parties or noticed by the same boys. At 17, when I got accepted into a small liberal arts college 2 states away, Mom's reaction was muted. "Well, that's nice," she said, before immediately turning to Emma and asking how her latest dance recital went. When Emma got into a state school with a football team and a name-brand sweatshirt, there was a party. Balloons. Cupcakes. A new necklace. I watched from the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes, telling myself I'd escape eventually, that distance would fix things. It didn't. Even in adulthood, the imbalance followed us like a stain that never quite washed out. I called once a month, sent Christmas cards, remembered birthdays. Emma, on the other hand, could forget Mother's Day entirely and still get praised for being so busy with the kids. She had excuses. I had expectations. That's the dynamic we lived in. Emma made mistakes, and Mom called her overwhelmed, while I made boundaries, and Mom called me cold. At family dinners, Emma's stories were always center stage: her youngest's piano recital, her new countertops, the way she managed to fold laundry while doing yoga, and I would be asked, in the tone one uses for a distant cousin, "So, how's work going?" Before the topic was quickly redirected to something more entertaining, more comfortable, more Emma. The worst part wasn't the favoritism itself, it was the way Mom denied it so thoroughly, so fervently, that I started to question my own perception of reality. Every time I raised the issue, gently at first, then more directly, she'd shake her head, look at me like I'd grown two heads, and say things like, "You girls are so different, I love you in your own ways," or "Emma needs more from me right now, she has more on her plate." Or my personal favorite, "Don't turn this into a competition, Hannah, that's not healthy." As if I was the one keeping score. As if I hadn't spent my entire life trying not to. There was one day, years ago, that still sticks in my throat like a splinter I can't swallow. I was 16, and Emma had just crashed the family car into a stop sign after sneaking out to meet a boy at midnight. Mom didn't yell. She didn't ground her. She made hot cocoa, ran a bath, and whispered that girls make mistakes while brushing her wet hair. 2 weeks later, I came home 20 minutes past curfew because my friend's mom had car trouble, and Mom waited in the dark, arms crossed, mouth tight. Irresponsible, she called me. Selfish. That was the first time I remember feeling something shift, not just disappointment, but something deeper, something that said, you could do everything right and still be wrong in her eyes. And then Dad died. It was a heart attack, sudden and brutal, in the middle of a Tuesday. I was the one who found him. I was the one who called 911. I was the one who sat in the hospital hallway staring at beige walls while a nurse with tired eyes told me they couldn't save him. And when Mom arrived, makeup smudged and hands shaking, the first thing she said, her very first words, were, "Where's Emma?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" Just, "Where's Emma?" As if I hadn't just watched our father die. As if my pain was secondary. As if I was secondary. That was the moment I stopped hoping. That was the moment I realized I could disappear, and she might not notice until the next holiday. I moved away after that, took a job editing technical manuals, the kind of work nobody reads, but somebody has to do, and lived in a small apartment with uneven floors and no photos on the walls. I told myself I was fine. Independent. Unaffected. But every birthday, every holiday, every cold cup of tea reminded me that some wounds don't scar, they just stay open. And now, sitting in that kitchen, with Emma coughing into her hand and Mom's face turning from concern to horror, I felt the weight of all those years coalescing into a single, terrible clarity. I wasn't invisible. I was ignored. And there's a difference. Because being ignored means you still exist. And existing means you can choose what happens next. It was Emma's birthday again, a day that always arrived with the same unspoken ceremony, a sort of family-wide recalibration where everyone was expected to pause, admire, and orbit around her as if she were a celestial body that determined the tides of our collective attention, while I stood on the edge like a forgotten moon, flickering dimly, just close enough to watch, but never quite close enough to touch. I arrived at Mom's house right on time. Not out of excitement or obligation, but out of the kind of mechanical guilt that builds up over decades of being the afterthought, the one who never caused a scene, never missed a call, never got a thank you card. The driveway was already crowded, which didn't surprise me. Emma's husband, the kids, maybe one of her Pilates friends, possibly even that one woman from church who always hugged too long and asked how my love life was going. As if being unmarried at 38 meant I was both tragic and suspicious. The living room was draped in pale pinks and creams, ribbons curling down from the ceiling, and a glittery "Happy Birthday, Emma" banner hanging crookedly across the mantel, like it had been pulled too hard by someone trying too hard. There were flowers on the table, roses and lilies, and a cake that looked like it had been ordered from a high-end bakery with a French name, topped with edible gold flakes and fresh figs, luxury for a woman whose life was already a continuous gift. And I, as usual, was greeted with the kind of warmth reserved for polite acquaintances or second cousins, the obligatory air kiss, the light touch on the arm, the "oh, you look so good," that didn't mean much, delivered with distracted eyes already searching the room for someone else more interesting to talk to. Mom came toward me, her hands full, her eyes bright, her voice pitched just high enough to seem enthusiastic, but not so high as to break the illusion of effortless hospitality. "There you are, honey," she said, already turning away. "I poured your tea. It's on the table, right next to Emma's seat." She didn't look at me when she said it. Her hands were busy with ribbon and tape, wrapping the last of the presents in front of everyone, even though Emma had already opened at least 4 bracelets, a gift card to a spa retreat that came with a handwritten note about deserving rest, and a framed photo of her and Mom in matching scarves, laughing at something I hadn't been invited to. I walked over to the table, where 2 mugs sat side by side. One was warm to the touch, full of steam, with a tiny sprig of mint resting on top, like a garnish on a cocktail. The other was visibly colder, dull in color, with a faint smudge of lipstick on the rim, Mom's lipstick, a matte peach tone she'd worn for as long as I could remember, a color that always struck me as hopeful and outdated at once. That mug, chipped near the handle, had clearly been poured first, and likely forgotten, then brought out only after Emma's had been prepared with attention and care. I stared at them for a long moment, just standing there in the middle of the celebration, my fingers grazing the cooler porcelain, my eyes flicking back to the room where laughter rang out like wind chimes in a storm, pleasant but chaotic, slightly off-kilter. Emma was showing off her spa card, reading aloud the list of treatments, giggling about getting a real facial for once instead of slapping on that drugstore mud mask while chasing the twins around, and Mom was nodding, proud, her eyes moist with joy, as if she'd just received an award herself. That's when the words echoed again in my head, not because anyone said them, but because they were always there, hovering. "We love you equally. We just show it differently." It was the kind of phrase that sounds noble, even poetic, when spoken with the right inflection, but when put under the microscope of experience, it disintegrates like cheap paper in water. There was no equal in this house. There never had been. And the way she showed love to Emma, with time, with gifts, with warmth, had always stood in cold contrast to what I received, which was often silence, judgment, or worse, pretense. My hand moved before I had fully decided. I picked up the mugs, switched their positions, gently and precisely, careful not to spill a drop. The chipped mug with the lipstick ring was now Emma's. The fresh one, the one with the mint, was mine. It wasn't about the tea, and maybe it never was. It was about the choice, the first time in years I had made a conscious decision to stop accepting the imbalance, to stop performing the role of the grateful understudy, while Emma took the stage, year after year, to thunderous applause from the only person whose approval ever mattered to us both. I took my seat, held my mug with both hands, and blew on it softly, savoring the warmth, the luxury of feeling considered, even if it was stolen. Emma sat down beside me, picking up her cup absent-mindedly, too busy scrolling through photos of the spa to notice anything unusual. "This tea smells weird," she said lightly, taking a small sip anyway, then shrugged and turned to tell Mom about the infrared sauna. And Mom, dear Mom, smiled across the table at both of us like she'd done a good job, like her daughters were sitting in perfect harmony, sipping tea and laughing at the right jokes. She had no idea. None of them did. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to correct her. I let her believe it. I let her swim in that illusion because illusions were what she gave me for years: plastic smiles, hollow reassurances, birthday cards with $10 bills and no message. This was no different. Eventually, someone brought out the cake, and we all stood to sing. I sang too, my voice low, steady, watching Emma across the flames of the candles, watching her with the cold mug in her hand and the lipstick stain pressed to her mouth. She didn't notice. Of course she didn't. People like her rarely notice anything that isn't framed and presented with a bow. But I noticed. I noticed everything. And somewhere between the second verse and the laughter that followed, I felt something shift, not just in the room, but in me. Not anger. Not vindication. Just a quiet, solid awareness that I had crossed some invisible line, and whatever came next, I wouldn't flinch. Because this time, I had given myself the better cup. There's a silence that falls over a room not when everyone stops talking, but when something unspoken starts to vibrate beneath the surface, a tension you can't quite name, but can feel in your molars and your stomach and your spine. And as we sat around that long, honey-colored table with its carefully folded napkins and centerpiece of over-arranged hydrangeas, I could tell that something had shifted, though no one else seemed to notice. Not yet, anyway. Emma was still chattering away, the mug in her right hand hovering close to her lips as she flipped through her phone with the other, her thumb gliding across the screen like nothing in the world could touch her, like the air around her would always bend to make room. Always shield her from the sharp corners that people like me had grown used to bumping into. I was sitting just across from her, the warm mug between my palms, inhaling the faint scent of mint and chamomile, a gentle contrast to the brittle sweetness of the cake that had already been sliced and mostly devoured, its remnants scattered on plates in the form of crumbled sponge and smudged frosting. The room was warm, too warm. The heating turned up just a bit too high. Mom always said Emma got cold easily, and the lights above us cast a golden hue that was meant to feel cozy, but now made everything seem overly bright, too exposed. Like a stage set lit just before the curtain rises, and everyone has to play their part, no matter how tired they are of the script. Emma took her first sip without ceremony, lifting the mug with the lipstick stain to her mouth and swallowing quickly, not even pausing to register the temperature or the taste. She made a face subtle, but I saw it, and set the mug down again, rubbing at her throat briefly as if trying to clear something stuck. Mom was slicing another piece of cake, talking to one of the cousins about the renovations Emma and her husband had just done in their kitchen, quartz countertops, of course, and those farmhouse-style cabinets that every Instagram homemaker seems to love. And no one noticed when Emma coughed once, a short sound, not dramatic or alarming, just enough to punctuate the end of a sentence. But I noticed. Of course I did. Because I had been watching her, not with malice, not even with resentment exactly, but with the kind of focused attachment you develop after years of observing someone who lives on a completely different frequency than you do. Someone who has floated through life with soft landings and constant applause, while you've had to claw for attention in the quiet corners of the room, behind the scenes, holding up the scenery that everyone else forgets exists. She coughed again. Louder this time. Enough that Mom looked up from the cake and tilted her head, her eyes narrowing in that way she does when she's deciding whether something is a real problem or just another attempt by someone to steal Emma's spotlight. Emma, she asked, not quite concerned yet, but closer. Emma waved her hand in the air, shook her head slightly, and coughed once more, her brow furrowing like she was annoyed with herself, like her own body was betraying her at the worst possible moment. I took another sip of my tea, still warm, still slightly sweet, just the way I liked it, and said nothing. And then it started. Not a dramatic choking or a collapse, nothing that would qualify as immediate emergency, but a steady escalation, a tightening in her throat, a sharpness in her breath, her coughing growing deeper, more ragged, the kind of sound that makes people turn their heads. Not out of curiosity, but out of fear, because there's something about the human voice when it's struggling to function that triggers every primal instinct we have. Mom was on her feet now, her expression morphing from mild concern to full-blown panic as Emma pressed her napkin to her lips and pulled it away to reveal a smear of dark red, not bright like a cut, but thick, like something pulled up from deep inside. The room went silent. Forks paused midair. Conversations died in the throat. Even the kids, who had been running laps around the living room, stopped and stared. Emma looked confused, embarrassed, then terrified. I don't know what she gasped, trying to speak, but the words were chopped up by more coughing, and now there was blood on her blouse, small dots at first, like a bad nosebleed, But then a blotch, a splash, and suddenly she was standing, reaching for the edge of the table as if grounding herself to something real, something solid, because the ground beneath her was no longer reliable. Mom screamed her name. Not a call. A scream. And still I sat there. Still, I didn't blink. I watched, calmly, like I was watching a scene in a play that I already knew the ending to, my fingers wrapped around the ceramic warmth of my mug as if it were the only thing tethering me to the moment. My heart didn't race. My palms didn't sweat. There was no spike of adrenaline, no flood of regret. There was only observation, sharp, cold, precise. Mom rushed to Emma's side, her hands fluttering uselessly over her daughter's arms and face, calling for help, yelling for someone to call 911, her voice rising and cracking like old wood under pressure, while Emma fell to her knees with a guttural, awful sound that made even the dog whimper and retreat under the couch. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just watched. And maybe you think that makes me cruel. Maybe you think that something inside me broke a long time ago, something fundamental and human, the thing that makes people rush forward in moments like this, to hold, to soothe, to fix. But it didn't. I wasn't broken. I was exhausted. I was tired of pretending that fairness existed, tired of the quiet expectation that I would always be the one who stepped back, who understood, who made space. I was done shrinking myself to fit into a family photo that had never made room for me. Emma collapsed sideways into Mom's lap, and the tears started then, not Emma's, but Mom's, hot and wild and immediate, not just fear but guilt, maybe, or at least the beginning of it, though guilt has never been her natural state. She looked up at me, her mouth open, searching for something, anything, an explanation, a comfort, maybe even an accusation, but I gave her nothing. No reassurance. No alarm. Just a level gaze that told her, without words, that whatever was happening, I hadn't caused it, not directly, and yet I wasn't surprised by it either. Sirens wailed in the distance, still a few blocks away, and the room was chaos, voices overlapping, someone crying in the hallway, someone else trying to explain something to the emergency operator, but I remained still, the eye of the storm, finally and completely centered. And in that moment, something inside me settled, not with joy, not with triumph, but with a sense of balance that I hadn't felt since childhood, the feeling that, just for once, someone else was experiencing what I had lived with for years, a confusion, a fear, a sense of not understanding why things were going wrong when you had done everything right. Because that was Emma now. And I knew exactly how that felt. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and disappointment, that unmistakable sterile tang that clung to your skin and refused to let go. No matter how deeply you tried to breathe through your mouth or distract yourself with the outdated magazines scattered across the side tables, their pages curling at the edges like tired petals, it was the kind of space designed not for comfort, but for endurance, for sitting and stewing and wondering without answers, which made it the perfect place for a moment like this, suspended, uncertain, irreversible, but still cloaked in that medical ambiguity where nobody says anything too specific, because no one wants to be wrong before the paperwork is printed and the liability is signed. Emma had been taken in with a flurry of movement, 2 EMTs pushing the stretcher through the automatic doors with a quiet urgency that didn't quite match the panic we'd seen in the living room, but still carried a weight of consequence, the kind you don't argue with. Her breathing had stabilized in the ambulance, or so Mom had repeated 3 times to the nurse, as if by saying it enough, she could will that moment into permanence. But there was blood, and blood made everything worse, more dramatic, more real. It stained her blouse, her lips, the towel someone had shoved into her hands. And it stained Mom's hands, too, though she didn't seem to notice. She sat beside me now, still, hunched forward, her elbows on her knees, her hands clenched together in a way that made her knuckles pale and her shoulders shake occasionally, though she wasn't crying anymore, just breathing hard, shallow. Like she was afraid that if she inhaled too deeply, the truth might slip in through her lungs and nest there, unwelcome and inescapable. She hadn't said much since we arrived. Neither had I. We sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds being the gentle hum of vending machines, the occasional cough from an old man across the room, and the distant intercom announcing a code blue in another wing, words meant for other people, other families, other tragedies. I sipped from the paper cup of coffee I had gotten purely for the ritual of it, knowing full well it would taste like burnt water, but somehow needing the act of drinking it to keep my hands occupied, to keep from reaching over and doing something impulsive like patting Mom's arm or wiping the dried blood from her wrist. Eventually, she turned toward me, not all at once, but slowly, as though moving her body required permission from something inside her that had not yet caught up to what had happened. Her eyes were glassy but not wet, her mouth slightly open like she had started a sentence and forgotten how to finish it, and for a moment, she just stared at me, studied me, not with suspicion exactly, but with that dazed, searching expression people wear when they're hoping the person in front of them has some piece of information that will help them make sense of the last hour. And then she asked, in a voice so thin and cracked I almost didn't hear it the first time, "Did you put something in her tea?" The words hung in the air between us like smoke, curling and shifting and impossible to contain. I didn't respond right away, partly because I wanted her to sit in the silence that followed, and partly because I wasn't entirely sure what the right answer was, if such a thing existed. I didn't want to lie, but I didn't want to give her the kind of truth that would make everything too simple, too neat, too easy to wrap in a moral bow and dismiss as madness or spite or grief. So instead, I laughed. Not a loud laugh, not hysterical or unhinged, but a soft, incredulous sound, almost like a breath catching on a memory. I looked down at my cup, swirled the coffee a little, and then looked back at her, my voice calm and even and far too measured for what she probably expected. "I didn't make the tea, Mom," I said, letting the sentence sit there for a moment before continuing. "You did. You poured it. You brought it out. You set it on the table. And you handed the better one to Emma." Her face didn't change at first. She just blinked, slowly, as though absorbing the words took longer now, like her comprehension had to travel through a fog of disbelief and decades of self-justification before reaching whatever part of her brain still had the capacity to feel shame. "I just swapped the mugs," I added, my tone flat, not defensive or angry, just factual. "That's all. Yours was the one with the lipstick." A long pause followed, a pause thick enough to choke on, and when she finally spoke again, it was barely more than a whisper. "You knew it was bad." "I knew it was cold," I replied. "I knew it tasted wrong. I knew it wasn't meant for her." She looked down at her hands then, as if expecting them to offer some guidance, some answer, some absolution, but all they gave her was evidence, stains on the fingers, a slight tremor. The unmistakable imprint of her own neglect brought to life in a way she couldn't deflect or repackage as maternal wisdom. And for the first time, I saw the edges of her pride begin to crumble, the practiced veneer of calm and control slipping just enough to reveal the rawness beneath. "She could have died," she whispered, and I nodded, because that was true. "But she didn't," I said. "And now maybe, just maybe, you'll finally understand what it feels like when the person who's supposed to love you the most hands you something that poisons you slowly." She didn't reply. She didn't deny it. And that silence, her silence, was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get. A nurse eventually called her name, and she stood on unsteady legs, moving toward the double doors with the same hesitation you see in people stepping into cold water, every muscle flinching from the inevitable shock. She paused at the threshold, turned back to look at me one last time, her eyes filled with something that might have been confusion, or grief, or maybe just the beginning of clarity, and I held her gaze, steady, unblinking, not because I wanted to intimidate her, but because I wanted her to finally see me, not as the shadow behind Emma, not as the strong one, not as the background daughter whose feelings were always less urgent, but as someone real, someone who had swallowed bitterness for years, and finally stopped pretending it tasted sweet. When she disappeared through the doors, I stood up slowly, tossed my half-empty coffee into the trash, and walked to the vending machine in the hallway. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt clean. Lighter, maybe. Not redeemed. Not absolved. But awake in a way I hadn't been in years. I bought a cup of tea, black, strong, hot, and sat back down with it, sipping slowly, letting the warmth spread through me like a truth finally spoken aloud. I didn't know if Emma would be okay. I didn't know if Mom would ever admit what she'd done, or what she hadn't. But I knew this much: I had stopped accepting the cold cup. And whatever that made me, a monster, a mirror, or something in between, I didn't blink.